Please join me in welcoming Melinda Gates.
Well, thank you, everyone. I have to say, it's great to be back in Texas. You may or may not know that I grew up about 3 hours north of here in Dallas. And one thing as I was reflecting, getting ready for this, I was thinking, gosh, that kind of feels like light years away from the stage and where we are today in this conversation. I have to say, when I think back, I really didn't know a lot of women who worked outside of the home when I was growing up. In fact, my role model, one of my only points of reference, was Alexis Carrington. She was, this conniving oil executive on Dynasty. And she wasn't exactly the perfect role model, because I think that one of those years when TV Guide came out with their 60 nastiest villains of all time, she was number 7 on the list. So most of my ideas about a kind of career that I wanted to have actually came from my dad. And my dad was an engineer at an aerospace company that contracted for NASA. And some of my very favorite childhood memories were when my parents would let my sister and I stay up in our jammies and watch those Apollo launches. I remember seeing that very first rocket shoot into space and thinking my dad and his team that I knew had something to do with that. And so he was literally at this point in time as part of expanding the universe. And as I grew up, I thought, I want to make my contribution too. So if you fast forward many years later, a computer science MBA degree in hand, I then landed a job at Microsoft. And it was absolutely everything I'd been working for. I was so excited about being on the cutting edge of technology and the innovative company. It was a company of less than 1,700 employees at the time. It was my dream as a kid to work for a company like this. But I have to say, I wasn't there very long, several months actually, before I started thinking, maybe I'm gonna quit. Maybe this just isn't the right place for me. Now, I was the only woman in my hiring class of 10 MBAs, but that wasn't exactly what bothered me. I was pretty used to being the only woman in the room when I was coding in computer science in university. But the problems for me kind of started to begin, honestly, at the first orientation, when one of my fellow hires decided immediately that he was going to pick a fight with the VP who was speaking at the front of the room. And I thought, well, that's a little bit of a bizarre way to start a job. And it turned out, I learned later, as he told me, that he'd been advised previously by a professor the week before that he should be more assertive. And so I guess he picked that moment to try out his new assertive tactic. But it wasn't just him. Several colleagues that I worked with were very aggressive, even abrasive, and I would say combative. And I, quite frankly, started worrying about fitting in. Would I fit into this culture? Could I fit in? And I wish I could stand up here and tell you that perfect story. I drew on this inner reserve that I had, and I just knew I would persevere. But I have to tell you, it took a while for me to realize, and it wasn't just at first, that what I was doing was wrong. I was actually trying to emulate the people around me and force myself into their way of being, their mold. But it wasn't too terribly long later that it occurred to me, maybe I wasn't the problem, maybe the mold was the problem. Now, this is a story that repeats itself in industry after industry, generation across generation. Young people, especially women, and people of color, enter the workforce. They're so eager to have their talents on display, to use all this knowledge of everything that they've learned, to have their ideas finally taken hold. But all of a sudden, they bump up against these barriers and these biases. And that starts to make them question whether, in fact, they belong. And that's because even though the American workforce has evolved dramatically over the course of my lifetime, the American workplace hasn't caught up to that. It's still designed largely by and for people who look like my dad. And quite frankly, it works really well for those people. If you're a white guy with a degree from Stanford, like my dad was, and a stay-at-home partner, it works great. But the true measure of success should not be whether it works for a young man or a young woman with none of those characteristics. That's the measure of success. Can it work for people who don't look like my dad? And that's exactly where we're falling short. Minorities in the workforce. We have so many young people entering the workforce, and yet they don't feel like it's their workforce or the place they want to be. They're both stalled in their entering, and they're stalled in not rising as high. And in part, that's because the modern workplace still assumes that talent looks exactly like one thing and comes from one place. It doesn't know what to do with people who don't fit that pre-existing mold. It doesn't challenge those biases and barriers that keep out certain people. And it doesn't invest in the mentorship and the support that would welcome every single person in. It asks parents and caregivers to make these absolutely impossible choices about work and about family. Many people are surprised to know that only 15% of people who work in the private sector have access to paid family leave. 15%. Now, how can you possibly balance work and family life if we don't own up to the fact that we're having kids and it takes time and some time off to have those kids and raise them well? So it's increasingly clear that the status quo is unsustainable. It's slowing the pace of growth in our economy, it's slowing innovation, and it's squandering and wasting opportunity. It's holding all of us back. That's why I wanted us to have this conversation today at South by Southwest. This is where you come into the conversation. You have an outsized role in designing what the workplace should look like. You can decide who you want to be surrounded by tomorrow, what culture you want to have inside the company that you either lead or work for. You know we can't keep building the same off that same old blueprint that created the old boys club. What you can do is insist on equality in the workplace. It can be part of every single conversation that you have inside the place that you work. It's up to you all. You can lead a radical redesign of how we think about work in this country in the 21st century. And really, it starts by better understanding the realities of today's workers, who they are, where they're coming from, what supports they need to rise as high as their talents will take them. So let's, all of us today, during this hour, let's think big. Let's think boldly. This is our chance to create a future of breakthrough innovations that's open to anyone who dreams of making them happen. That's the future that I believe in. So now what I'd like to do is introduce to you three incredible women to talk about the future of the workplace. And the first one that I want to introduce is Joanna Coles. She is now the content editor for Hearst Magazines, a position that was created for her. Prior to that, she had held the position of editor-in-chief for Cosmopolitan, the leading female brand. She also sits on the board of Snapchat and Women Entrepreneurs in New York City. Please help me in welcoming Joanna Coles.
That was great. I wish that I had heard someone say those things when I started in the workplace on Fleet Street, because I was so aggressive, because that's what women were taught to be, taught to have a voice. So do you think things have changed since you sat, as you watched your father go off to work and come back and he inspired you, but do you think things have changed for working women now?
Well, we absolutely know there are more women in the workforce. Today, there's 63% of couples are dual income. So there are totally more women in the workforce. And you see them in droves. You see them everywhere. But whether the workplace has changed much for women, I would say only marginally. And I think that women will tell you that they run into all of these barriers and biases all the time. And we're not recognizing the fact that they carry the bulk of the unpaid work that happens still at home.
Right.
So we have to both recognize that, and they have to redistribute the work at home. When you have a dual income couple, you got to really think about who's doing what on any given day.
Now, you're part of a rather famous dual income couple. I would, and I bet almost everybody in this audience would like to know, what are the conversations that you've had with Bill, who, after all, you've got 2 daughters, you work together at Microsoft, and he's known for being unbelievably competitive in the workplace.
Definitely. We've had lots of conversations about what we want our foundation culture to look like, and actually how I want all the amazing, innovative, great thinking minds, just like he had at Microsoft, at the foundation. I can tell you we have a lot of those, but how the conversations need to include everybody and not just work for some of the people, and be more collaborative. So we have that conversation all the time about work. He lets me give him very concrete and honest feedback, because I sit in many meetings with him where he does well and some where he doesn't do so well. And we also have conversation at home about this unpaid work. I mean, our home life was designed around, at first, him being the CEO of Microsoft. That was a very hard job. But when he left Microsoft, and we are both working at the foundation, we had to shift a lot of the tasks at home. So I had time to do other things in the evening besides the kids, and to travel. Like today, I'm gone. Guess who's home today? He is. Guess who's here? Me. Right? And he came home from a trip last night.
That's worth a round of applause. So, and you have 2 adult daughters, you have a son too, but what are the lessons that you want your daughters in particular, well, and your son actually, to take from watching the 2 of you pass the baton back and forth?
I want them to know that every relationship can be equal, whether at home or at work. Everything should be equal. And we have open, honest conversations about that at home. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that my son, on his 18th birthday, let me post a piece about him being a feminist. And he has even helped me question my own beliefs around that. It was interesting because my kids know that I'm a big proponent around the country for paid family leave. And I was so excited when I saw Mark Zuckerberg actually take it, because I think that's an amazing role model. He took 2 months, which is very unusual for the CEO of a tech company. My oldest daughter said, "Why did he only take 2 months?" And I was like, So your kids help you question it. If you really want them to believe in equality, like for me, I realized I was telling my oldest daughter, even when she was young, to use her voice in the world. And then I realized I wasn't role modeling that for her. And so I had to question who I was and how I wanted to use my voice if I'm going to also tell my daughter that's what's right for her.
And do you think the messaging around sort of women in leadership is positive for young women? Because one of the things that I worry about is that young women think that it's going to be too difficult to get one of the top jobs, because the conversation around women's career is often framed in terms of, well, are you going to have a family? How are you going to manage this? It's very difficult. And people warn women against taking a big job, whereas they encourage men to take it.
What I'm seeing is that the young women coming out of college will tell you at that point, they're still thinking, I'm going to rise to the top. But something happens when they actually start to truly think about having a family, which for this generation is getting older all the time. So it's more as, later in their 20s as they hit 30s. And then they start to say, oh, well, I'm going to have to trade something off. And so I think that's where it gets difficult. Sheryl Sandberg talks about this, and you should insert your point of view on this, because I think you've coached women, right, at that middling part of their career. What do you tell them about reaching the top?
Well, I would tell any young woman in the audience here today, if you are even remotely thinking about having a child, go and have the child, assuming you have someone that you want to have it with, or perhaps you don't. Perhaps you don't, and that's okay too. But I do worry that young women often put work ahead of having children children until it's too late, and you don't want to reach 40 and then have to rely on IVF because the odds are really stacked against you. And I worry that it's a conversation we don't have enough of in our culture. I really think you need to start thinking about it in your 30s. But that leads us to two more brilliantly timely people who are joining us this afternoon for this conversation. Nina Shaw, who started, or was one of the founder members of both one of Hollywood's leading law companies, but also, even more relevantly for this discussion, Time's Up, and Stacy Brown-Philpot, who is the CEO of TaskRabbit.
So we have the drinks. And then we're done here.
Come and sit. Hi. So I wanted to start with you, Nina, and understand what it was like actually being in the room when Time's Up sort of morphed out of the chaos that we've seen emerging from the American workplace.
Well, I think morphed out of the chaos is a great way to describe it, because during that period when we realized how many of our friends and colleagues had been subject to such horrendous behaviors, women started to come together in small groups and talk about what we were going to do. And one of those groups morphed into Time's Up. And I recall that we were all sitting together, and there was, kind of the beginning, the bitch fest. But then after that, it was, okay, well, we're going to do something. We're going to take action. And the timing was great because we had received, the women of Hollywood, especially the survivors of sexual harassment, had received a letter from the National Farm Workers Women's Alliance. And we sat in this meeting, and America Ferrera read the letter out loud to us, and we were all in tears by the time she finished. It was so touching because what these women said were, we are your sisters, we come to you understanding that you have been subjected to the kinds of things that we are subjected to. We are all women in the workforce. And we said, well, what are we going to do? And we immediately agreed we were going to take action. We were not going to just simply write them a letter back, although that would be good etiquette. We were really going to do something, and then we had contacts within the National Women's Law Center. They were talking about putting together this legal defense fund, which we felt was a real need for, and more importantly, would be something for all people subject to harassment, not just women in the entertainment industry, not just women in the farm workers union. But they said in that room, but we need at least $10 million to get it started. And we all kind of gulped, because $10 million is not a small sum of money. And I think it was Shonda Rhimes who said, okay, I think just in this room alone, we have easily $2.5 million. We can figure this out. And it just gave us the courage to go forward. And within a 60-day period, we had launched and announced, and we had raised at that point more than 10 million. I think we started with about 15 million.
And can I ask, did the check from Mark Wahlberg clear yet?
Yeah, Mark has written his check.
So I mean, it's no stranger, I'm sure, to anybody in this room, because this is a very intelligent-looking crowd, by the way, that there is often a delta between what men and women get paid in all sorts of industries. The delta between the $80 that Michelle Williams got and the $1.5 million that Mark Wahlberg got for coming back to do an extra day's filming seems unbelievably egregious. How could that have happened?
Well, Joanna, first of all, you're right to raise the issue of pay disparity, because pay disparity is in the entertainment industry just like it is in all places where women work, where women and people of color work, where people other than white men work. But in that particular case, it happened for a number of reasons. One is which men often get paid more, not because they're better actors, but because they're often in stories where they drive the narrative. And the reason they're in stories where they drive the narrative is because the stories are picked by men. So you see this pay inequity. In their case, I have it on good authority that Mark had the right to approve the lead actor. So at the point Kevin Spacey was out, his replacement had to be approved by Mark, and I understand that as part of that negotiation, he insisted on additional payment. But where the system, I think, really failed Michelle in a time when it should not have, when the issue was being so highlighted in the media, was because she was under the impression that everyone was not being compensated additionally for this additional amount of work. And just so you know, in her contract and in most contracts, you would not be compensated if you had to come back within a certain period of time you had completed your services. That's in most entertainment contracts.
And they had the same representation, right? They were both with William Morris.
Yeah, and part two of that, they had the same talent agent. And somewhere in there, either his agent didn't tell her agent or her agent didn't tell her, but somebody didn't talk. This was known at some level, and it wasn't communicated. And it was a huge embarrassment. And out of it, the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund did very well. But I think it's shown such a light on it that I've found in the negotiations since then, and especially the negotiations that we're just concluding now for the television pilot season, and aided by changes in the law in New York and California that don't allow you to ask for people's prior salary history, that women are being paid significantly more than they were being paid before these laws and before this event happened, but we're still not there yet.
Well, that's a wonderful thing to hear, though. Yeah, that's definitely worth applause. So I want to come back to a couple of points you've made there and refer them back to the tech, particularly the fact that men get to drive the narratives so much. And there seem a lot of parallels with the tech industry there in terms of men raising the capital and being founders. But I want to bring you in, Stacy, because as CEO of TaskRabbit, you really are creating a workplace of the future, or the new way that people are going to work, the gig economy. Talk to us a little bit about how you stop discrimination in that, in terms of people buying each other's services.
Yeah, so for those, I'm sure many of you have used, this is a tech room, so I'm sure many of you have used TaskRabbit.
But we should ask, actually, can we have a show of hands for those who...
Yeah, it's a good.
Okay, good.
Yeah, people know the service. That's great. It's a two-sided marketplace, and what that matters a lot because it allows us to give the taskers who provide the service the agency to decide how much they want to work, how much they want to get paid, and then the clients who use the service get to choose who they want to hire. And our role is to democratize the way people hire for services. And so we've grown to have 60,000 taskers using TaskRabbit to earn a meaningful income. So this is, people talk about the future of work, but this really is the way that work is getting done today. We just launched TaskRabbit in Detroit a year ago, and Tim, who was a school teacher who couldn't pay off his student loans, is doing that now because of TaskRabbit. And so the way that we help with discrimination is we have people create profiles. We really educate around how to create a profile that is consistent across the services that we provide. The other thing that we've done is we notice that women sometimes, just like in our jobs, we don't always want to negotiate for the highest salary that we can get. Well, the women who task on TaskRabbit often don't set the highest hourly wage that they can set. And so we educate them about what's the fair wage for what you can make today, what's the fair and livable wage. And by doing that and making it transparent and showing what the numbers are, we've seen a higher, greater of equality around wage and earnings across all the categories on the platform.
But you've still had to educate women more than you have men about asking for more money.
We do, and it's consistent across all industries. The beauty of TaskRabbit is that because of the transparency allows for the information to be shared by everyone. And so you can't hide it anymore. It's not a secret. It's not happening in the boys' bathroom. It's completely there and out in the open.
Okay, so Melinda, let's pick up on this point that Nina raised about men driving the narrative in Hollywood and still having 72% of the dialogue, which I've noticed they have in real life too, so maybe that's a sort of reflection, or at least in the offices where I am. Talk to us a little bit about the venture capital firm that you've been involved with, making sure that you're seeing women potential founders as well.
Yeah, so I look at a lot of the problems across the tech space, and there are several places to make changes. In this particular field of innovation, some of the investments I'm realizing are not just voice, but are putting my dollars down, making real investments where I expect a return. But I look for investors who are going to disproportionately invest in women and people of color. Because today, women get less than 2% of all VC funding goes to women-led startups. So, and for people of color, women of color, they get less than 1% of all dollars that go in VC. So if you have these great ideas, which I know many of us do, for people, for all kinds of things, your chance of getting investment is minuscule. So I gave money to or invested money in a group called Aspect Ventures, and it is led by Teresa Gao and Jennifer Fonstadt. They're two amazing investors. They have a great track record, and they're disproportionately funding women-led businesses, but with the goal of making money.
So how is it possible that a young industry starting in Northern California can give only 2% to women-founded businesses?
Well, because it is that old, you invest in what you know, and so you get this boys club, I won't call it old, but this boys club where they start investing, they see the Stanford and the Harvard graduates coming out and they invest in their ideas, and those ideas turn into success, and so they invest in what they know. And they also, and it's safe to invest in what you know, but they also don't see the markets that a woman would see, or a person who grows up in a very diverse community might understand a market in a way that these white guys don't. They'll sometimes go home and ask their wife, well, does this make sense? Some woman presented this to me. And because she's high income, she may not see it at all, or she may not know anybody of color, right? So she may not even know that is, and it's a huge opportunity. So 10 years from now, these guys are gonna realize all the deals they left off the table. So, but we have to disproportionately make sure we start putting money in that direction. And you're gonna see lots of ideas of success. And we're gonna look back in 10 years from now and go, it is crazy that more money wasn't flowing in that direction.
And can you talk a little bit then also about how that impacts the culture of these companies? I mean, you look at the chaos that came out of Uber. You've seen the various VC men that were sort of offering money, but with benefits that they wanted, not benefits for the females going to try to raise the money. So just talk about how it infects the culture too.
Well, it's a lot like, I would say, the financial industry in Wall Street was before they got called out, and I still don't think that's completely fixed. But when you don't have women at the table or in the company in positions of power, not just at low levels, but at positions of power, you don't have people of color, things like that can happen and perpetuate themselves, and nobody calls them out on it. And they start to, and the company starts to be successful, and so you ingrain that culture more and more and more. And then women see it. Believe me, women in the Valley talk. I've talked to so many women who've worked in different companies, run the venture gauntlet on Sand Hill Road, and the women don't want to go there either. They're like, ooh, stay away from that place. So it becomes this flywheel that just gets going, and then it becomes an all-white male culture, and that seems okay when it is not okay. It's not at all okay.
It's actually not good business.
It's terrible business. You're not going to have as good of products. We know that from good research now.
Well, and you see what happens to the management too, right? That it's not good for the management of those companies either, because there's no one calling bullshit on a lot of the excessive behavior.
And it's why we also need a crux of women on boards. We know one woman can't make a difference on boards, but you start to get 2, 3, 4, 5, or equal representation and equal representation of people of color, then you start to get changed, because they want good business and they're willing to call the founder out and say, this is not okay.
So Stacy, talk about that, because when you were at Google and when you were at Goldman Sachs, you talked about being the only person that looked like you and that felt lonely. And I know at Google you did something about it.
Yeah, more than half of our leadership team at TaskRabbit is women, and it changes the conversation. Our product is used by mostly women. It would be silly for us to not have women at the head of the table making the decisions about the company. When I was at Google, I looked up one day, we were at several thousand people in the company, and there just weren't that many black people who looked like me. And so I said, I felt lonely, and I decided I needed to do something about that. And my first step was to go to Sheryl Sandberg and say, Sheryl, you've cared about women. Here, we need to get more black people here, and what can we do? And she looked at me and said, you're it. You're the person that we've been waiting for. And at some point growing up in your career, and many people in this room are early in their career, you're thinking about someone else who's taking care of you culturally or ethnically or gender, and at some point you become the person that's now responsible for that. And I became that person. So we set about and we created the Black Googler Network, and that network really became the way that we started to recruit from historically Black colleges and universities. We had a hiring gap, we needed to fill it. There's a whole population of people we were not targeting. And so we went out and did that. And then it became about community. How do we keep people in Silicon Valley? It's an isolating place. How do we build community in Silicon Valley? How do we keep people working at Google? So it changed the dynamic of, it's time to start now, and it's time to be the person that made it happen. It was admittedly selfish in the beginning because I just wanted a community around me, but it changed the conversation about diversity and inclusion at the company.
Well, and it's also kind of interesting because I think that being the person who initiates doesn't mean you have to be at the top. One of the things we always say at Time's Up is that come to us with what you want to do, but then also come to us with how you're going to do it. People say to me all the time, how do I join Time's Up? You are Time's Up. You know, where do you see an injustice? Where do you see something that needs to be remedied? And what can you do to be part of the solution?
So how's Time's Up thinking about how it goes forward to produce lasting change in the workforce?
Well, we're looking at many of the issues that all of us are looking at. We're looking at the issue of gender inequity. We have a board initiative to bring more women to boards. We have the 50-50 by 2020, where we're pushing companies within the entertainment industry to take pledges to achieve or attempt to achieve parity in their workplace as to people of color, other abled people, queer people, all of those people who just aren't at the table and who need to be at the table. We're very much about action. How do we make things happen? And we are continuing to raise money for the Legal Defense Fund. We're putting together more of an infrastructure now because all of us are busy people who already had full-time jobs. But we're not going to stop, and we're making that very clear. I think there's a bunch of guys waiting for this to be over. It's never going to be over.
That brings me to a really interesting point, I think. I'm sure I am not the only person on this panel, and I bet there are a lot of people in the audience who've heard this too, that there are now men who are saying, whoa, I'm never going to be alone with a woman again. I don't want to help any women. I'm staying away from women. I never liked them anyway, but now I really don't like them. How do we encourage men to step up and carry on where they have been and start, if they haven't been, mentoring young women?
Well, first and foremost, and it goes back to, Melinda, something you said, it's better business. We all say we want to have better businesses, so making those businesses more diverse, more inclusive, reflecting better the people who we're attempting to sell our wares to is a good thing. And also I say to men, because I hear this all the time, I say, listen, we all do code switching in our lives, right? If you're in a group of men, perhaps white men, you speak one way. If you're in a group full of women, and particularly women of color, you might speak another way. If you go home and you talk to your mom, you speak one way. To your grandmother, I mean, come on, you know how to speak to different people. So the idea that all of a sudden you can't speak to women, it's really just an excuse for not making change. And it doesn't. Yeah, we say famously in Hollywood, the only person who doesn't code switch is Ryan Coogler. Ryan Coogler sounds the same no matter who he talks to, if you've ever heard him interviewed. But most of us do make very subtle, sometimes nuanced changes in the way that we speak to one another. I think I said once to Oprah, you know, if you don't want to go home and say it to your mom, then don't say it to the woman who works in your office.
Melinda, do you think that this is, I mean, I've heard this a lot in Silicon Valley, and particularly older men are just terrified.
Mm-hmm. Well, they should be. I mean, you know, if they've participated in this, one thing I think we should call out here is, look, there are a lot of great men, too, in the tech sector. I worked with many incredible men, and I still do. I mean, I love to have teams that have men and women on. They're amazing. But we need to, you can't use this moment, because they are terrified, you can't use it as an excuse. Well, I'm now only gonna have drinks with guys, or I'm now I won't go to a meeting with a woman unless there's another woman present, a young associate. You can't do that, because particularly like say in the VC space, it's about relationships. We know a lot of that funding happens around a great business that's very innovative, sees a market sector that others don't see. But it's all about the networking. All of the networking effect is you get funded by all of these informal conversations. Or I talk to you, you like my idea, and then you introduce me over here to Stacy, and she introduces me over here to Joanna. So you cannot use this as an excuse, and we have to keep that out in the open and say that is not okay.
And sitting in Silicon Valley, there are great men in Silicon Valley who are thinking about this, and they're being allies. And
Definitely.
This is an invitation to be an ally, and to sort of think about the hashtag #MeToo movement as a movement that brings conversations. Time's Up is making a huge difference. We still need men to be allies. And it's okay if it's a little bit uncomfortable in the first part of that question on how do I help. But if you ask how you help, take everybody to drinks, take everybody to lunch instead of drinks. Include women in the conversation, and don't shy away and be afraid, because getting more women on boards, as Melinda just talked about, means getting more women into executive positions, which means mentoring those women, which means helping that junior person, which means bringing her to the meeting, which means including her in the lunch. So all of these things start from the beginning, and that very initial step of deciding you want to be an ally is possible. It's happening at a small scale in Silicon Valley, and I think it can continue to happen wherever you are, however big or small your company is.
Yeah, we actually had a Time's Up men's meeting. It was each member of Time's Up got to invite 5 men to a forum at UCLA, and I think about 200 men showed up. None of us from Time's Up women, were in the room with them. There was a quick introduction, and then I think J.J. Abrams and one other person, I think it was Franklin Leonard, got up and said, hey guys, we're in this together. What are we going to do? 2 experts on the issues of male-female relations came in and spoke to them. And the idea was to spark a dialogue. And the interesting part about it was this happened easily more than a month ago, and the press never found out about it until recently when we announced it. And from that, we've seen an offshoot of groups of men getting together to talk about what they can do. So you can be part of that. You can actually just call up a bunch of your buds and say, hey, you know what, let's talk about this Time's Up thing, this Me Too thing, and let's not be derisive of it. Let's not be protective of our own self. Let's just talk about how we really feel among ourselves. And if it's okay, don't tell anybody we did this. If you're that concerned that people will think less of you, but you need to find those people who think like you, because you all had moms, you have grandmothers, you all had women, sisters, women who you love and who you want to see do well in their jobs, and you want to be part of that. So just raise your hand. It's not so hard.
Yeah, and I think even separate from the sexual harassment, even the everyday sort of biases and kind of things that we women bump up against, or people of color bump up against, we all have to take it upon ourselves to change the cultures that we're involved in. So for instance, Bill and I run an organization of 1,500 people, a foundation, and I have mistakenly spoken over somebody, and I have to turn that on myself and say, oh, I interrupted that person. Just as when I sit at the head of the table and I see a man interrupt a woman, I have to stop the meeting and go, wait a minute, I want to hear what she had to say. Or if I hear somebody explaining over somebody else, man or woman, you have to actually stop it. And the people who work for me, I have to give them coaching too if they see that they do it. I mean, we all do these things, and we have to look at where our own bias is and how do we change that, and how do we hold everybody in our organizations, and for us it's even our partner organizations, accountable.
And it's difficult to do, right? I mean, I think I have made various suggestions in environments that I've been working in, and I've been told that you don't want to do anything that singles women out for preferential treatment because the men will complain. And so what I try and do, rather than meet that head on, is to sort of go around the side or go around the back and figure it out by stealth. But I am astonished even now, and even in the progressive industries, relatively progressive industries I work in, that it's hard to get people, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's hard to get certain people to want to give up power. And at a certain point, some of this becomes a zero-sum game, because even though the workforce is sort of expanding in some places, and certainly in the entertainment industry, there are going to be losers here. How do we address that?
Yeah, it's hard. I think when you're the recipient of privilege, it's very hard to recognize that. So if you're in a workforce that is predominantly one way, the truth of it is that you may not have even been the best person for that job. And it's a tough thing to come to grips with. The irony of it is, and I think I was telling you this earlier, we're in a great time in the entertainment industry as far as production goes, because all the streaming services like Netflix and Hulu and Amazon have created just an incredible, burst in production, more people being hired. So it's really interesting. This comes at a time when there are more jobs available, as opposed to maybe 20 years ago when we had 3 networks or 4 networks and there was a limitation on how much programming could be done. So you should be actually grateful that this is happening at a time when there are more opportunities for everyone. But those opportunities are going to be shared. And I know it is really hard sometimes to realize that maybe maybe you didn't get there alone just on your talent. I mean, tough, but true.
I don't think anybody got where they are just because of their talent. In any job, anywhere in the United States, you're standing on the shoulders of other people. Somebody helped you along. A teacher in school gave you that, extra push on your homework, that principal or leader who called you out, or the parent who put all the resources in investing in you. Look, none of us got our jobs just because we magically are so fantastic at everything. And so I think we all have to try and recognize that we're lucky. Anytime you have a good job, there's some piece of luck in it too, or somebody helped you. And so we always have to pay that forward and figure out, who is it I'm pulling up behind me? What men, what women, what people of color, how are we all pulling society forward? Otherwise, it's just not going to change.
Well, and I think also that it's easy to underestimate the amount of fear in the workplace, and that I'm constantly astonished as a perfectly outspoken person that I often, there are areas I don't want to go. And I wonder how you talk about that with some of the people that you work with, both in the TaskRabbit office and out in your bigger sort of diaspora of taskers.
Yeah, we try to open up the conversation. I believe a diverse work environment is a place where you can be your whole self and your authentic self and bring yourself to work, your whole self to work every day. And so the types of things that we do inside the company really reflect the tasker community that we operate in, where people are allowed to come in and ask any question they want to ask, and then we challenge each other on the things that aren't working. So if we aren't hiring enough women at the senior levels, then we're looking at the hiring slates of those women. If we're looking at a community where we're trying to build more taskers in a new community, we're trying to make sure it's a diverse community that reflects that population. Because we're in the middle of the 4th Industrial Revolution. Automation and technology is changing the way people will work forever. And as women, we have to be a part of that. As people of color, we have to be a part of that. Otherwise, no one succeeds. And so as we build communities of taskers, we're talking to them about how do we build this local community that is diverse, that reflects who we are, that is helping each other, that is training each other, that is upskilling each other. And we have the conversation about skills and abilities and the future, and less about how we look or what we look like as people. And that's been helping the conversation at the executive level and even at our tasker community level too.
And I think that's great. And also I think for young people in the audience, if any of you do ever feel any remote sense of anxiety about raising these issues, and I think a lot of people do because it's really hard and people can feel very defensive, it's often really helpful to remind yourself that we live in a time of really good big data, and that if you can ask for the data on your workforce, it helps do some of the work for you so that you're not always raising issues. And I think one of the issues I have felt as a female executive is that you always end up, because often you're the only person that wants to do it, reminding people that there may be a shortfall in diversity across the company and how do we address it. And it's exhausting always having to go back to that issue, and it's so much nicer when other people do it for you, and the data does do some of it. But Melinda, you and I have talked a bit about resilience in the workforce too, and the fact that you felt you had to be resilient when you were younger, and you were coming across all sorts of not exactly harassment, but sort of inappropriate comments or things that wouldn't get a pass now. Do you think that we are teaching young women to be sufficiently resilient now?
Well, I think it kind of comes from two places. I think it's really up to the workplace to change enormously, and I think we have to teach young girls to be resilient. But I don't know, I'm pretty optimistic. The generation I see coming up now who are in their late teens and early 20s, boy, they've been up a lot. You have to remember, their families lived through the Great Recession in this country. And so their view of things is different. Their view of, hey, finances and how much do I want to put in that changes. I mean, they remember their families coming up against hard times. So I'm seeing a lot of resilience there. But one of the things that makes me optimistic we can change the workforce to be right for everybody is the fact of what Stacy brought up, that it is changing. The gig economy is changing. Artificial intelligence is going to change it. We also are seeing companies respond to what their employees want. So a lot of social issues that employees are saying to their employer, look, I want to work for somebody who cares about, this social issue, criminal justice or climate change, or, having less plastic in the environment. I mean, we know, for instance, the big consumer companies just made a big commitment to getting plastic or using renewables by 2030. That's because of what they were hearing both from their consumers, but their employees. So companies all of a sudden are listening. They have to listen to what their employees want because there is a talent shortage, and they know that there's their talent that they've put a lot of investment in can be stolen away at other places. So I see this as an inflection point. I see the Me Too movement finally causing a reckoning of this is what's actually happened. And now I see, hey, we also have this inflection point of the workforce is gonna change. It is changing with the gig economy, is changing with artificial intelligence. So to me, now is the time. Like, we've got to grasp this opportunity and say, what is it we want? And it's one of the reasons I've been so vocal in the last 2 years about paid family medical leave. I mean, we're the only industrialized country that doesn't have paid family medical leave. Are you kidding me? That doesn't make any sense. And 25 years ago when the law got passed in this country, everybody thought it was just a first step, which is you could have leave at the federal level, 25 weeks unpaid. That's untenable. I mean, you have a single mom raising a kid, she can only cobble together 2 days to take off. She needs that job. So we have to have a good paid family medical leave policy. And so, I'm seeing 5 states have done it and DC, but we need one across all states and the federal level. Then you change the workforce so it works for single moms, dual income couples, no matter what your skin color looks like.
I know we have to move on to the question and answer, but one of the things I do want to say is that sometimes I feel like when people talk about a lack of resilience, especially among women and other marginalized people, that it's almost as if we're blaming people in some way. Because I actually find this to be an enormously resilient generation of people. I mean, when I look at people like Issa Rae, who started her television show on the internet, and now she's on HBO. I mean, she didn't wait for an opportunity to come to her. She just did it. I look at my client, Ava DuVernay. Ava just did it. She never waited. And that's one of the things I love about this generation. I feel like they are just people who are not so much waiting for an opportunity, but they are just going to bust those doors open. And what we really have to do is stop taking away the restrictions, the things that get in their way, and just let them get out there and do their thing, because they are fearless when given, when we don't put encumbrances in front of them.
So the only thing I would say to that, and you're absolutely right, and by the question I wasn't trying to imply that people weren't resilient, but what you do see is a lot of people, when they come up against some kind of inbuilt bias and resistance, just saying, you know what, I can't fight this on my own. I'm going to go off in a different direction. And I have a lot of friends who've ended up doing that. We've seen a lot of people giving up a career in Hollywood because it felt like you couldn't get through this. And that's what feels exciting to me about the Time's Up movement, that people have now bandied together and said enough already. We're not putting up with it.
And we know when you get societal change, the only time you get societal change across any country you look at is when people band together.
Yep.
That's right.
So, and even women at a local village level where there's 30 of them, when they finally come together, they'll tell you, none of us had our voice. But when they finally come together and go through and reckon with their experiences, all of a sudden they get their power. And everybody around them is like, whoa, these 30 women, they mean business. And then they can start going and doing things. So you have to get economic means in their hands, you gotta help people get their voice, and you gotta band together. And the same is true in the US workforce. There's power in having a group come together inside of Google and say, this is what we're not seeing here. We want something different. It's why when I would run up against barriers in industry, I would band together with other women and men who are like-minded. And then we could go and say, okay, how are we gonna create change? It's too hard to do alone. And so yeah, you usually go some other route, but find somebody, at least one, if not 10, that have the same issue you have, are willing to stand with you, and then you start to create change.
And you really just need 3. So a lot of people think it's 30 or it's 10, but it really just a community of 3 people have the power to change the dynamic of any group. 3 people in this room could change the dynamic of the 1,800 other people that are in this room right now.
Which is very exciting. And there's 4 of us, so we've already done
Look
it.
at that.
Watch out.
We've very happily, we've got lots of questions from the audience. I want to get through some of them. And the first one is, for the women who choose to stay home when their children are young, what can be done to help transition back? Which is a brilliant question, because I think it's very easy to suddenly feel out of it when your kids are young, and then it makes it doubly hard to come back. Melinda?
Yeah, well, you can literally just help them the first 3 or 4 weeks they're back. Pair them with somebody who knows them, or pair them with somebody who's a mentor or they can reach out to. Women, we know across the board, tend to have more doubt than men. And so when she goes out for maternity leave or a leave, getting her confidence back up is one of the things you just got to help with. And you don't have to do much. But reminding them they can do this, they are good. I don't know, Stacy, you have some examples, I think, too, right? From people who worked in your company?
Yeah, we give people time to come back. You might not come back full time at first, and literally saying, cut yourself some slack, telling her that it takes some time to come back. Like, hearing that message actually gives, I've been that woman, so I know what that feels like, gives you the confidence that you can get there. And oftentimes, it's also about creating the space to be comfortable. If you don't have a mother's room to pump, create one.
Yeah, and
Just make it happen and make these things easier.
yeah, but I also think we should address the women who are coming fresh into the workplace from having left completely and raised their children. And I think that we have to, the way we make it easier for them, I think, is to have more women at the top. Mm-hmm. Women who are going to be sympathetic and understand that just taking a few years off to raise your children, or hell, taking 10 to 15 years off to raise your children, doesn't make you a less desirable candidate. And we have to support, when we support women at the top, do understand that. Frankly, men at the top who are aligned with women, or who have wives who work, or other partners who work, understand that. So we change the top, which is a slow process, but we're at it. We will change that perception.
And I think also the more senior women you have in the workforce, the more you understand that life is ebb and flow, and your career is ebb and flow, your family is ebb and flow. You have different priorities at different times in your life. Doesn't mean you can't have it all, whatever all means to you. There are 2 questions I'm going to elide here. The first is, how do companies fully embrace inclusion and diversity with a very homogeneous pool of applicants? Is active recruitment the key? And then there was another question from a young man saying he's not yet in management, but how can he contribute to fostering equality in his workplace?
Yeah, so you accomplish what you measure. And if you have a homogeneous pool of applicants.
Can you just say that one more time? Because it's so important. Just say it one more time.
You accomplish what you measure. So be accountable to measuring the numbers. If it's a homogeneous pool of applicants, it will never change until you actively decide to change it. If you're using a recruiting agency, tell them don't come back to the meeting without a diverse pool of applicants. That's it. And then you fire them and go hire somebody else.
Very good.
That's it. And if you're the individual on the team, you have to work a little bit harder to expand your network. And that's going to take an extra hour. But as the women sitting on this stage have felt, we always take an extra hour to do something extra for the women who are coming behind us, the African Americans who are coming behind us. So if you're a male, and you may be a white man, I don't know who wrote the question, take the extra hour to go out and find a diverse applicant, have that person come to lunch at your company and tell them what a great place it could be for them to work there. That'll change the conversation.
It's not a homogeneous pool of applicants at all. It really isn't. It just means you haven't cast a wide enough net. In my own company, it's not an issue because everyone knows that they would never come in and attempt to fill a position having not really gone out and looked at the marketplace. And so as a result, we have a very, very diverse workforce. And we've never had any problems in maintaining that, not one. I mean, I have a small business, I have 20 lawyers and 10 of them are women, but it just wouldn't even, people would be afraid to come to me with anything other than a diverse group of candidates because they know the first question I would ask is, what happened? Is this is it? And they don't want to have that. They want to be able to say, and they will come to me, look at all the people I looked at. And we found, and I get these great explanations of how we got to where we are, and they almost always are very diverse candidates.
And see, these are the questions that have to come from the top. If the company doesn't demand it, it's not going to happen. And if they don't measure it, I mean, why is Intel getting good diversity numbers? Your bonus is now tied to your diversity number. How is it that Salesforce managed to to change why did they change their pay? They actually said, we're going to measure our pay gap. We think we might have one. It turned out they measured it was bigger than they thought, and then they took active steps. And the thing you can do in recruiting is we look in the foundation for very strong senior female scientists. They're very hard to find. But same thing, we would get, the resumes would come around, the 6 candidates they were going to put in front of us, and we're like, well, there are no women on it. And so we wouldn't close the interview loop. We only had to do that twice. And believe me, the recruiter got the message. The other thing we're trying is when we're looking at resumes now at any position in the foundation, we're anonymizing the names. We're also anonymizing the schools they come out of. Because I don't want to hire just from the Ivy Leagues.
Yeah. One of the shocking revelations to me as a boss in America, not having grown up here, which might be a surprise to some of you, but growing up in the UK, I got over here and I don't know the difference between any American college apart from, Harvard. That's the only one I'd ever really heard of. So I have no idea when I'm hiring people. And it was such a revelation and such freedom to not be stuck in the old ways of our previous my previous country, but sadly for us, time's up.
Yeah. So I want to just close the panel by saying so much thank you to Joanna and to Nina and to Stacy for this really important conversation.
And thank you too.